The last video that I put out was more or less just for fun. On this channel, I like to keep things more on the academic side, but after putting out a 45-minute long video on the miracle at Fatima, I needed a break. So I did a Reddit roundup where I just read a single post from the Catholic subreddit r Catholicism, and towards the end of that video, I accused some random online trad of being a little fascist. Now, it's true that a more precise word would have been authoritarian or maybe totalitarian. I'm sympathetic to the idea that that word fascist is overused and is being watered down because of it. And it probably should be saved for more specific cases than what I was using it for. Some comments on my video pointed that out to me, and I largely agreed. But one comment caught my eye. Ah, the R-Catholicism can of worms. Fascists may be closer to the mark than you thought. They have a rule saying no defending Franco because doing so causes arguments. To reiterate, there are enough people on there willing to defend Franco that it causes a problem. Sure enough, when you go to the R Catholicism subreddit and you look at the rules in the sidebar, you'll find the conditionally allowed content underneath the allowed content, and then beneath that is the disallowed content. At the very bottom of the disallowed content is discussion of Francisco Franco and his government. When you click on the hyperlink, Francisco Franco and his government, you get to a moratorium that was put out by the R Catholicism moderator team that reads, "There has been, for a while now, fierce arguments around former Spanish leader Francisco Franco. He is a controversial historical figure, viewed by some as a deliverer from oppressive communism, and others as a fascist mass murderer. What he was is not the point of this post. The conversations around him ultimately lead nowhere other than slap fights, and discussions about him are at best tangentially related to Catholicism. Therefore, we as the mod team have decided it is best to end discussion of Franco. We hope you're able to understand. God bless the mod team." When you search for posts about Franco, you get a weird mix of generally old and deleted user posts expressing sympathy for Francisco Franco and sometimes expressing outright approval of him, like this one: Franco defended Christian Spain during the Spanish Civil War. So who was Francisco Franco? Was he the totalitarian mass-murdering dictator that modern media paints him to be? And if so, why is Catholic Reddit kind of sympathetic to him? Let's start with a brief outline on Franco, how he rose to power, what he did during the Spanish Civil War, during World War II, and after. Franco rose to power during the Spanish Civil War. The Spanish Civil War was fought between the nationalists and the communists, also called Republicans, but that's confusing because the Republicans are a political party in the modern United States, so I'm going to refer to them as communists for the rest of this video. Spain's Civil War began in July 1936 and officially ended with Franco's nationalist forces' victory in April 1939. There were international parties involved on both sides, with the Italian and German nationalist dictators Mussolini and Hitler sending forces to aid Franco, with Stalin's USSR backing the Spanish communists. The government of Mexico also sent monetary aid to help the Spanish communists. Francisco Franco started the war as Generalissimo Franco, the leader of the nationalist forces, but within the first few months of the war, he declared himself caudillo, or chieftain, a brand new title that effectively meant something like the dictator. The Civil War was violent and bloody. Death tolls seem difficult to estimate, but are generally put in the many hundreds of thousands, including the deaths of tens of thousands of civilians at least. Atrocities were committed by both the nationalists and the communists. The atrocities committed by the communists in Spain during the Spanish Civil War are collectively referred to as the Red Terror, and the atrocities committed by the nationalists are collectively referred to as the White Terror. During the Red Terror, the communists killed approximately 50,000 people. Again, the death tolls seem to vary greatly, with estimates as low as 30,000 and as high as 100,000, but 50,000 seems to be a middle-of-the-road figure. Of these 50,000 killed, many were clergy. Thousands of priests and monks and hundreds of nuns are counted among the victims of the Red Terror. Some of these clergy were killed in very violent manners, including torture. Non-clergy Catholics were killed as well, such as Catholic school teachers or just well-connected Catholic laypeople. Catholics weren't the only victims, though. The communists killed political rivals, landowners, and business owners as well. During the White Terror, the nationalists killed approximately 100,000 people, plus tens of thousands more people after the Civil War ended. Like the Red Terror, death tolls are hard to pin down, and estimates are as low as 50,000 and as high as 200,000. The victims of the White Terror include captured combatants, as well as political opponents, public school teachers, trade unionists, suspected Freemasons, and tens of thousands of seemingly innocent civilians. Nationalist forces massacred thousands of civilians in each of several cities upon capturing them from the communist forces, including around 10,000 civilians in Cordoba, 9,000 in Badajoz, and 2,000 in Granada, and many more other cities. The White Terror also counts clergy among its victims, though not nearly to the same extent as the Red Terror. Franco's forces did kill Protestant and Jewish clergymen, although they also killed a small number of Catholic clergymen who were suspected of cooperating with the communists. After the war, the victorious nationalist forces set up their new government, a dictatorship under Franco, and Franco promptly executed tens of thousands of enemies of the state, political enemies and prisoners of war. About 400,000 people were sent to concentration camps, or forced labor camps for political opponents, if you prefer the term. Thousands died in those concentration camps, primarily through starvation and poor sanitary conditions. A Francoist psychiatrist, Antonio Vallejo Najera, carried out medical experiments on prisoners in the Francoist concentration camps to, quote, establish the biopsych roots of Marxism. This psychiatrist was fluent in German and worked with the Nazis in the late 30s and the early 40s, since they shared beliefs about how Jews were an inferior race, among other similarities. Much of Franco's regime was built off of the general anti-Semitism of the day. Franco himself referred to the communists as a Jewish Masonic Bolshevik conspiracy. Sir Paul Preston, a British historian, writes that, quote, the extreme right was determined to destroy the communists and its reformist agenda and to justify its efforts. The cover was used that this was a life-or-death struggle to defend Spain's traditional values against an attack by a coordinated force of leftists and Freemasons, masterminded by the Jews. But Sir Paul Preston does go on to say that the Francoist forces, quote, did not fight in the Spanish Civil War in order to annihilate the Jews, but anti-Semitic and anti-Masonic propaganda had served to unify and intensify enmity against the communists. Side note, I normally try to do a better job of citing sources than I did in this brief summary of the Spanish Civil War, but this channel is not a history channel, so if you do want to contest any of the claims, or specifically any of the death tolls that I used in this video, please do, and then at that point in the comment section, I'll either need to provide you with my sources or just shut up. But for the last several decades, modern media has viewed Franco as a dictator similar to Mussolini, Hitler, or Stalin, complete with his own mass executions and concentration camps. So, why do some Catholics seem to have sympathy for Franco? By and large, Catholics do not seem to feel the same about Hitler or Mussolini. Is Spanish nationalism more palatable than German or Italian nationalism? To get an answer to that question that isn't a complete straw man, I went to two sources. First, I went to Reddit, where all the posts about Franco are at least 1 year old, since it became such a problem there that nobody's allowed to defend Franco anymore. And the results there are interesting. This post here reads, today is the 40th anniversary of Francisco Franco's death. Franco defended Christian Spain during the Spanish Civil War. The body of the post goes on to talk about the atrocities committed by the communists, none of which I contest, and then it ends by saying it's also the death anniversary of Jose Primo de Rivera, one of the leading figures of the nationalist faction. Like Franco, Primo de Rivera was a devout Catholic. So referring to Franco as a devout Catholic and as somebody who defended Christian Spain during the Spanish Civil War. There's no mention at all in this of the atrocities committed by the nationalists. It's interesting, in the comments, lots of people are saying effectively what I've said so far in this video. This user right here, one of the most upvoted comments here says, it's also important to remember that the nationalists did not have clean hands during the war. They killed priests on the Republican side, which I said earlier, the nationalists did kill Catholic priests, not nearly in the same numbers as the communists, but they did kill Catholic priests. Franco also suppressed the culture of the Basque and the Catalonia regions in order to create an artificial singular Spanish identity, which is why those places want independence to this day. There were also Catholics on the Republican side, like Antonio Fontan, who was a member of Opus Dei and advocate for press freedom, who became the president of the Senate in 1976. Had Franco not died when he did, Spain would have undergone a Portuguese-style civil conflict. I can't really speak to that, but there's this comment as well. I'm pretty sure Franco was up there with some of the worst bad guys. History can get muddled, though. So this one guy is, and his name is Deus Volt, and keep in mind this was also 8 years ago, but Deus Volt is talking about how Franco was such a good guy, a defender of Christian Spain, and a devout Catholic, and other Catholics in the comment section were pushing back. Then there's this post from 5 years ago. What do you think about the legacy of Francisco Franco for Catholicism? He says that he finds Francisco Franco the most interesting. He gets overlooked. He was very complex. On one hand, he was authoritarian, but on the other hand, he gave Spain in some ways the boost it needed to turn into a well-functioning state. He was a strong Catholic, and one of the reasons he had strained relations with Nazi Germany was because he disliked what he viewed Hitler's attempts to warp it. I'm not so sure about that. I think that some of the disconnect between Francoist Spain and Hitler's Germany was because Spain was just, even though they were more or less a fascist state, they just simply didn't have the resources to actually help Hitler because they were still getting over their civil war. They did send some forces to fight with Hitler, for the record. However, I think that Hitler wanted more out of Spain than Spain was able to give them. Also, by like 1941, it became obvious that Hitler was losing the war. So the Francoist government started to kind of try to publish some things that were nice about Jews and things like that. And they actually advertised Franco as like the savior of the Jews because they were allowing Jews into Spain so that they could flee to other countries. But notably, the Jews were not allowed to stay in Spain. The comments here are things like, I'll bet dollars to donuts that your opinion about the legacy of Francisco Franco correlates with your political opinion. I don't know if I fully agree with that. I know a lot of conservatives who don't think that Franco was a good person, so I'm not sure that's entirely right. Then there's a lot of other people, look, deleted comments, a lot of this stuff is deleted, but saying that they don't like Franco. Referring to Franco as a mixed bag, still, I think referring to him as a mixed bag is being too generous. And then there's this one. What a quaint view you have of one of the 20th century's most egregiously violent autocrats. You can't appreciate the exaggerated deference he gave to the church and still recognize that his leadership was neither Catholic nor what the church believes a good public leader should look like. So there's very clearly pushback happening in these comment sections. Last one that we'll look at is a post from 6 years ago, how the Catholic Church in Spain has committed suicide. This user is talking about how Vatican II forced Spain's Catholic Church into essentially, a downward spiral, and the church in Spain is committing suicide. Whatever you believe of Franco or the monarchs before them, one thing is clear: the church was guiding far more people to salvation before than it is now. So this person is trying to argue that like Franco was this, great force for Catholicism. And what can we learn? The church must be involved in politics or will become irrelevant. Yeah, like Franco was involved in politics. And look, separation of church and state is the worst political situation for the church. A lot of people in the comments were offering alternate reasons why the church is in decline, is saying that it probably doesn't have as much to do with separation of church and state. Also, this person is saying Franco may not have been the worst of the worst, but I still don't want government mass killings, even if it is a Catholic government. A Catholic police state is still a police state that doesn't respect one's rights. Yes, we've taken rights too far, but the answer is not to get rid of certain rights. So I think it's very clear. This is not a popular opinion among Catholics, even though there does seem to be some kind of vocal minority of Catholics who are pushing these ideas. The other place that I went to, though, was Catholic Discord, particularly my friend Kyle Whittington's Discord server. Speaking of Discord, I have a Discord that I'm really bad at promoting, but if you want to join my Discord and kind of talk about these kind of tangentially Catholic topics, I'm going to put the link in the video description down below. But having seen the weird Reddit phenomenon where some vocal minorities seem to be promoting that Franco was a good leader, but the majority seem to think that he was not, I wanted to ask that question in Kyle's Discord server. I said, hi friends, I've opened up this whole big can of worms that I'm looking to get some feedbacks from practicing Catholics. So I commented the other day that somebody on the subreddit r Catholicism was being kind of fascist. Now, I was definitely being loose with that word, and a far better word would have been authoritarian. But someone pointed out to me that r Catholicism actually had to make a rule stating that nobody was allowed to defend Spanish dictator Francisco Franco anymore, because it was becoming very popular to do so on that subreddit. Here's an example of a thread that was locked where the original poster was explaining why he's sympathetic to Franco. I went on to say, my gut reaction here is that this kind of online Catholic is even rarer than the trads that I grew up with, since not even the FSSP chapel that I grew up attending defended Franco, not as far as I can remember anyway. It's been a while, and all I remember is that Francoist Spain was technically neutral during World War II. Select battalions were sent to Germany to help the Nazis, so Franco was essentially a fascist dictator, and he had his own concentration camps and stuff. But I'm not an expert on 1940 Spain or the Spanish Civil War or anything like that, so I'm coming here to ask you all, am I missing something, or is my gut correct that it is exceedingly rare for Catholics to support Franco, and this weird phenomenon is a strictly online thing that you really won't find in real life? And most of the comment responses were, Francisco who? I've never heard of this guy before, honestly. I blame my government education. Seems kind of edgelord, so I think I agree with you. Never heard of him either, which is a surprise given how many World War II documentaries I've seen as a kid. But unless you've given some gross misrepresentation, which I don't expect you have, that sounds obviously deeply antithetical to authentic Catholic expression. Not that Catholics always hold to things that are in line with their beliefs, unfortunately. Some people went on to say it depends on which Franco we're talking about, which is like, sure, but I don't think that these people on Reddit are asking if anybody else is sympathetic to the 14-year-old Franco. I don't think they're saying, like, is anybody, sympathetic to Franco before he committed these atrocities? I think it's clear to me that they're asking if somebody is sympathetic to Franco even though he committed those war crimes. Then, lastly, there was full-on approval of the Francoist regime. This user says, do people really think it's a sin to approve of Franco? He saved Spain from communist and Republican persecution of the church. Remember, communists, Republicans, same thing. So you're upset because he put criminals to death like every other leader in all of human history? Is there some other reason you don't like him? At the very least, if you know anything about history, you have to accept him as the lesser of several evils. If you know a good bit about history, you should accept him as a good ruler, like the Holy Father did. I'll just leave this here. Sure enough, Pope Pius XII was very friendly to the Francoist regime. The Vatican signed the Concordat of 1953 with the Francoist regime, which granted the official Vatican recognition of the right of royal patronage, a historical privilege of Spanish kings to appoint clerical figures within the Catholic Church in return for official Vatican recognition of the Francoist Spanish government. Also, the Spanish government under Franco promised to allocate government funds from the government of Spain to fund priestly salaries and to build churches, as well as a complete tax exemption for the Catholic Church and only the Catholic Church. In Francoist Spain, the Catholic Church was the only legal church. Catholicism was made the official state religion of Spain. Non-Catholic religions were not permitted to publicly advertise their church services. They could not publish books, and they could not own property. Non-Catholic religions could not own property. Catholic education became mandatory, even in public schools. Laws were passed abolishing divorce and banning the sale of contraceptives. So that might be the first reason why some modern Catholics think that Franco was a good leader, not just the better of two bad options. They excuse the mass killings because he married church and state. Lots of trads and trad-adjacent Catholics point to the syllabus of errors as evidence that Catholics should oppose separation of church and state. And Franco is probably the ultimate and perhaps the only example in the last 100 years of a leader who married church and state very closely like that. I will call anybody who holds that view that I just outlined as morally bankrupt, my moral anti-realism notwithstanding. And I will not apologize for it. I think it is super gross to look past the murder of hundreds of thousands, with at least tens of thousands of those being innocent civilians, just because your tribe got the political favors that it wanted in the end. But I think that there's another reason why some Catholics think that Franco is a good leader, and I find this one far more likely than legitimately them excusing the deaths of hundreds of thousands. And that would be that I think that a lot of Catholics think that Franco is a good ruler simply because they're unaware about all the people that Franco had killed, including the innocent civilians. If you go back to Reddit and Discord, in those posts that were approving of Franco, there was a common theme of, sure, Franco had a war to fight, he had opponents to kill, so what? This, to me, looks like those people are just unaware of the innocents that the Franco government murdered. So this being unaware of the mass murder, the concentration camps, and the anti-Semitism, mixed with this attitude of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, in my opinion anyway, is far more likely responsible for the trad and trad adjacent approval of the Franco regime than any kind of endorsement of mass murder. I know I dunk on trads and fundamentalist Catholics a lot on this channel, but I like to think that I'm fair. And outright approval of genocide is rare. It's rare among trads, too. I mean, I think that the very fervent pro-life attitudes that are essentially part and parcel of being trad is evidence of the trad opposition to murder, to genocide, right? And if that's the case, then I would imagine that these trads who are so fiercely pro-life would also be anti-Franco if they knew that so much of Franco's killing was wanton murder of innocent civilians. I do want to reiterate that, as far as I know, this weird devotion to an anti-Semitic dictator is rare, even among trads. So, in terms of Catholics who approve of Franco, I imagine that we're talking about that is a tiny percentage of all Catholics. And then among that tiny percentage who do approve of Franco, I imagine that those who know how many innocent people Franco killed is also a small percentage of that. So I think that the amount of Catholics who actually think that Franco can be excused for murdering hundreds of thousands of people just because he gave political favors to the Catholic Church is a tiny, tiny percentage. But a word of advice to Catholics who might know Catholics, who do openly sing the praises of the Francoist regime, take a note from the Catholicism subreddit. Tell them to stop talking about it. It's a really bad look for Catholicism to be singing the praises of a dictator who is responsible for the deaths of over 100,000 people. And I think that many Catholics share this goal with me, this goal of keeping Catholicism as non-radicalized as possible. And I think that stopping public praise for a mass murdering dictator is a good first step towards that goal.